The mud in Silver Pines Square was the kind that sucked at your boots and didn't let go without a fight. Harlan Croft's carriage sat in the middle of it like something God had dropped there to prove a point. 4 matched bays, brass fittings on the traces, a coachman in a coat that cost more than most men earned in a year. The carriage door swung open, and Harlan stepped down onto a plank his man laid across the mud, never letting his boot leather touch the mire. Every soul in town had come out to watch. Lydia Thorne stood in the square with her hands at her sides and her chin level. She was 23 years old. She wore her father's mending coat, the elbows worn to gray. Her hair was pinned barely. The cold had put color in her cheeks that looked like health and wasn't. Harlan Croft was not a large man. He had learned early that he didn't need to be. He walked toward her slowly the way a man walks when he knows no one will stop him, and he unfolded a paper as he came. "Your daddy borrowed against the deed," he said loud enough for all of them. $3,000 at 8% compound. He died owing $4,600 and change. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes because it didn't need to. The banks agreed to forgive the full amount, in exchange for a reasonable arrangement. Someone in the crowd laughed. Someone else shushed them, but not hard. The paper had her father's name on it in ink that looked slightly wrong, too dark at the bottom of the letters, the kind of darkness that came from pressing hard with a fresh nib over an erasure. Lydia had studied it 3 times in the 2 weeks since the funeral, standing at the kitchen table with a candle held close enough to make the paper translucent. She knew exactly what she was looking at. Harlan reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring. A diamond. It threw light in the gray morning like it was showing off. "You'll sign the marriage contract this morning," he said. "We'll settle the debt before the magistrate by noon." He reached for her left hand. His fingers closed around her wrist, and then they stopped. His face changed. Not gradually. All at once, the way a lamp goes out. On Lydia's finger sat a ring of black iron, rough-hammered, the metal still faintly ridged where it had been worked. It had no stone. It had no shine. It looked like something made by a man who had no interest in beauty and every interest in permanence. Harlan knew what it was. Every man and woman within 20 yards knew what it was. The dread moved through the crowd like cold water finding low ground. Men who'd been grinning a moment ago went still. A woman near the back pressed her child's face against her coat. The iron ring of Iron Crag, the mark worn by the man they called the Mountain Beast, the killer who'd vanished into the high peaks 6 years ago after what happened at the Donahue shaft. No law had gone up after him. Not twice, anyway. Harlan Croft's hand released her wrist. His voice, when it came, had lost its performance. What was left was just the voice underneath, smaller, harder, uglier. "Where," he said, "did you get that?" Lydia looked at him the way you look at something you have already measured and found wanting. She did not answer. The crowd was utterly silent now. Even the wind had dropped. Somewhere behind the livery a horse stamped once and went quiet. Harlan's diamond ring caught the light in his fist. Lydia's iron one caught nothing at all, and that somehow was worse. 30 days before Harlan Croft stepped out of his gilded carriage, Lydia Thorne was burying her father in frozen ground. The Reverend spoke for 11 minutes. 3 people came. One of them left before the dirt was filled in. That evening, Lydia sat at the kitchen table with her father's papers spread flat under the lamp. She wasn't crying. She had the arithmetic to do. Her father had kept 2 sets of numbers his whole life, the ones he told people, and the ones he wrote in the small leather notebook he thought no one knew about. Lydia had known since she was 14. She'd watched him record every transaction in his careful hand, cross-referenced to the penny. The habit had passed to her the way habits do, without ceremony, simply by proximity. The bank's notice said he owed $4,600 and change. Her notebook said he owed $2,112. The difference was not rounding error. She went to the bank at 8 in the morning with the notebook under her arm. The lobby smelled of pipe smoke and damp wool. The clerk behind the counter, a boy named Peterson who'd gone to school with her brother, that looked at her the way men look at things they don't intend to take seriously. She asked to see the original loan ledger. He told her the ledger wasn't available for public review. She asked who had authorized the compound rate listed in the notice because her father's contract specified simple interest at 6%, not 8. Peterson went and got his manager. The manager brought Harlan Croft. She hadn't expected that. She should have. Harlan arrived with 2 members of the town council behind him, and the 4 of them stood in a row across the marble floor, while Lydia laid her notebook open on the counter and walked through the figures. She kept her voice flat and factual. She pointed to the discrepancy in month 14, where the compounding had begun without notation. She pointed to the entry in month 22, where a payment her father had made. She had the receipt. She placed it on the counter, did not appear in the bank's running total. One of the council members smiled at the other. Harlan picked up her notebook and looked at it the way a man looks at something a child has drawn. "Lydia." He set it back down. "Your daddy was a good farmer. Nobody said otherwise." He glanced at the men beside him. But a woman who spends her days working livestock doesn't have the background to interpret financial instruments. There's no shame in that. The other council member, Jeb Pruitt, who had eaten at her father's table every Thanksgiving for 9 years, nodded slowly. "The bank's figures are correct. This is a settled matter." She stood there while they talked around her. Her left hand was pressed flat on the counter. She could feel the cold marble through her palm. The original ledger, the real one, not the altered copy Harlan had produced, was at the hunting cabin. Her father had told her once, without context, that he kept a duplicate record somewhere safe. She hadn't understood why until now. The cabin was on the upper slope of Iron Crag, 3,000 feet up. The trailhead was 2 miles from the edge of town. The sky outside the bank window had gone the color of pewter. The storm that had been building for 4 days to the northwest was finally moving in. She could smell it through the gaps in the window frame, something electric and sharp and indifferent to human inconvenience. Pedersen showed her to the door with the professional courtesy of a man removing a piece of furniture. The snow started before she reached the end of the street. Not gently. The first flakes were the size of coins, heavy and purposeful, the kind that meant what they said. Behind her, the bank door closed. Ahead of her, the mountain waited. She pulled her father's coat tighter, put her head down, and walked toward it. The mule lasted 4 miles. It went down in a gully where the trail had turned to a river of slush, one foreleg punching through the ice crust into nothing, and that was the end of it. Lydia got the saddlebag clear before the animal struggled upright and bolted back downhill. She didn't blame it. If she'd had the option, she might have done the same. She went on foot. The storm hit the upper slope differently than it hit the valley. Down in Silver Pine, it was snow and misery. Up here, it was something with intention, wind that found the gaps in your coat and stayed there, visibility that dropped to 10 feet, and then to 5, the trail markers her father had blazed into the pine bark, disappearing one by one under white. She stopped counting time. There was only the next step and the one after that. When the cabin's outline materialized through the gray, she nearly walked past it. Her eyes had stopped trusting what they saw an hour ago. But the shape was too angular for rock, and she changed direction and put her hand on the door and pushed. The door swung inward. The fire was already lit. She stood in the doorway with snow blowing past her into the room and looked at the man sitting across from it. He was large, the way landscape features are large, not remarkable, until you were standing next to one and realized the scale was wrong. He sat on a low stool with his forearms resting on his knees, and even folded like that, he filled the corner of the room. His face was a record of things that had happened to it. A scar ran from his left jaw to the corner of his mouth. His hands resting open on his knees were the hands of a man who had spent years doing work that left marks. He looked at her without moving. She looked back. Her right wrist had caught a branch coming down the last slope. She'd felt the skin open, felt the warm before the cold closed over it again. The sleeve of her coat was stiff where it had already begun to freeze. She knew what happened next if she didn't deal with it. She'd watched it happen to a hired man on her father's property when she was 12. She stepped inside, pushed the door shut behind her, and scanned the cabin. Peg on the wall with a coil of rawhide. A broken sled runner in the corner. Rags folded near the woodpile. She took the rawhide down, bit off a length with her back teeth, and picked up one of the rags. The man on the stool watched her. She worked by the firelight, improvising a pressure wrap around the wrist, the rag for patting the rawhide wound twice, and knotted with her teeth and her good hand. Tight enough to matter. Her jaw was clenched, not from the pain exactly, but from the concentration of doing precise work with cold fingers that had stopped feeling like her own. She didn't look at him while she did it. When she was done, she sat down on the floor near the fire, because her legs had decided that was what was happening now, and she examined the knot she'd tied. It would hold. Something crossed the man's face. Not warmth. Something more like the expression a man gets when a calculation comes out correctly. He stood the ceiling, cleared his head by 2 inches no more, and reached to a shelf above the fireplace. He set something on the floor between them and stepped back. Flint and steel. Fire's going cold by morning, he said. His voice had the texture of something that didn't get used much. You let it die, you won't see noon. She picked up the flint. It had good weight. She turned it over once. I know how to start a fire, she said. Then prove it. She looked up at him. He was already turning back to his corner. On the far wall, low to the ground, half hidden behind a rotted canvas, a tin box the size of a ledger. Black iron hinges. A hasp she recognized from her father's descriptions, though she'd never seen it. The lock on it was solid rust, frozen shut. She closed her hand around the flint and said nothing. The berries grew on the north-facing wall of the ravine, small and dark red, the kind that puckered your mouth and left your fingers stained for days. Lydia had learned their name from a mining almanac her father kept on the shelf beside the Bible, not for the berries themselves, but for what happened when you crushed them with ash and let the acid do its work. She spent the first morning collecting them in her coat pocket, while Bram watched from the cabin door and said nothing. She crushed them against the flat of a stone with the handle of a spoon, mixed in ash from the fire pit, in the ratio she remembered from the page, and packed the paste against the lock's hasp. Then she waited. Bram crouched beside her after a while. He studied what she was doing with the same expression he'd had when she wrapped her wrist, not approval, not skepticism, just attention. Acid, he said, from the berries. It'll take the rust if I give it long enough. He was quiet. Then how do you know that? I read. He looked at her sideways. Women in this town don't generally read mining almanacs. I'm not generally anything, she said. He went back to his corner. It took 2 applications and most of the second day. On the 3rd morning, the hasp moved. On the 4th, it opened. The ledger inside was her father's handwriting, 32 pages, every entry dated, every figure cross-referenced to a receipt number. Lydia sat close to the fire and read it twice, beginning to end, while the storm pressed against the walls and the temperature outside dropped to something the thermometer wasn't built to measure. She found Harlan's name on page 11, not as a creditor, as a co-signer on a separate account, one that drew from a pooled fund. The fund had contributions from 16 Silver Pine families, their names listed in her father's careful hand. Savings accounts, retirement money, a schoolteacher's 20-year deposit, the widow Marsh's inheritance from her brother out east. Harlan had been withdrawing from it for 5 years. Small amounts at first, then larger. The final figure was not a number she could hold comfortably in her mind all at once. She was still reading when the ceiling cracked, not slowly. One sharp report like a rifle shot, and then the north corner came down, not all of it, but enough a section of roof beam and packed snow, and the wall beside it buckled inward. The tin box skidded across the floor. Lydia grabbed the ledger and rolled clear, and came up against the far wall with snow in her collar, and the cold hitting her face like a flat hand. Bram was already at the collapsed section. She watched him work. There was no wasted motion. He knew where to put his hands, which piece to move first, which beam was bearing weight, and which was already dead. He'd spent years underground. He understood how things failed, and in what order. He got the door clear. It cost him the skin across both knuckles and a gash along his right forearm that opened wide and bled freely onto the snow. Outside, the storm was beginning to thin. The wind had dropped 2 hours ago without her noticing. Inside, by the rebuilt fire, she threaded the needle she'd found in her father's kit and put 4 stitches in Bram's forearm with the precision of someone who had sutured fence-cut horses since she was 16. He sat without moving. His jaw was set. He watched her hands. "You don't flinch," he said. "Neither do you." He looked at the ledger on the floor beside her. "What's in it?" "Everything." She tied off the last stitch. "Harlan's been stealing from the whole town for 5 years. Every family that trusted him." She smoothed the bandage flat. "I can prove it. Every line." The fire popped. Bram looked at the pickaxe head mounted on the wall above the door, black iron-old, the handle long since rotted away. He'd hung it there himself years ago for reasons he hadn't explained, and she hadn't asked. He stood, took it down, and fed it into the coals without ceremony. An hour later, when the iron had gone the color of sunset, he pulled it out and worked it against the hearthstone with 2 flat rocks for tools shaping something small and crude and permanent, while Lydia watched the firelight move across the ledger pages and waited for morning. When he was done, he held it out to her without speaking. It was rough. It was black. It weighed almost nothing and felt like it would last forever. She put it on. This was the moment Harlan's question hung in the air unanswered. "Where did you get that?" Lydia let it hang there another 3 seconds, long enough for the crowd to shift, long enough for Harlan's certainty to develop its first crack. "I got it on Iron Crag," she said. "Along with this." She reached into the saddlebag at her feet and lifted the ledger onto the flat top of the hitching post beside her. Her father's ledger, water-stained at the corners, the cover warped from the cold. 32 pages of a dead man's handwriting. Harlan's eyes went to it. Something moved behind his face and went still again. "That's a dead man's notebook," he said. "It proves nothing. It proves everything." She opened it to page 11. "But I'll start with what it proves about you." The crowd hadn't moved. They were the same people who'd laughed in the bank lobby 30 days ago: Pruitt, the council members, the clerk, Peterson, the widow Marsh, who didn't yet know what Lydia was about to tell her. They stood in their good coats with their arms folded, waiting for the spectacle of a woman failing in public again. Then the mist at the far end of the square shifted. Bram walked out of it. He didn't hurry. He moved the way he moved on the mountain, each step placed with full weight, no wasted effort. He was still wearing the same coat he'd worn in the cabin dark with old weather, the right forearm wrapped where she'd stitched him 4 days ago. He came to stand 6 feet behind Lydia and stopped. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The crowd's silence changed quality entirely. 2 men near the front stepped back without appearing to decide to. Pruitt's face went the color of old tallow. Even Harlan's coachman up on his box gathered the reins tighter in both hands. Harlan recovered faster than the others. He was practiced at recovery. "This man is a wanted criminal," he said loud enough to reach the back of the crowd. "Sheriff, you have your duty." The sheriff, a thin man named Cole, who had held the job for 11 years, without once making an enemy he couldn't afford, looked at Bram. Then at the crowd. Then at his boots. Lydia spread her hand flat on the open ledger page. "Page 11, she said at normal volume, because the square was that quiet. Harlan Croft co-signatory on the Silver Pine Community Savings Account, established 1871. She turned to face the crowd. Widow Marsh, you deposited $460 the year your brother died. It's written here in my father's hand with the receipt number. She looked at the widow directly. Check your passbook against what's in this account today. Every dollar you deposited is gone. The widow's mouth opened. Lydia turned a page. Schoolmaster Ennis, $312, 19 years of deposits. Another page. The Garfield brothers, $700, their father's land sale. She kept going. Name after name, figure after figure, the handwriting steady under her finger, the numbers adding up in the cold morning air to something enormous and irreversible. The crowd was changing. She could see it happen. The men who'd folded their arms were letting them fall. Pruitt had gone very still in the particular way of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. Harlan's hand moved toward his coat. Bram's eyes tracked the movement. Harlan's hand stopped. These are fabrications, Harlan said. His voice had lost its carry. Produced by a desperate woman and a murderer. No court in the territory will touch them. Lydia looked up from the ledger. No, she said. But I haven't finished. She turned to the last entry. The date at the top was 6 years ago. June. The notation was 3 lines in her father's hand, cramped and hurried, different from his usual careful record, the kind of writing a man does when he doesn't have much time and needs to get it down before the moment passes. Bram had not moved, but something in him had gone very still, the way a man goes still when he hears a sound from a direction he wasn't expecting. She looked at him once before she read it aloud. His eyes found hers across the distance between them. She held up the page so the nearest men could see the handwriting, and she began to read. Her father's handwriting was small in the cold air. June 14th, 1873. Witnessed at the Donahue shaft. H. Croft present at time of Aldrich Voss's death. Wound inconsistent with cave-in. Map of silver deposit removed from Voss's person before company men arrived. I said nothing. God forgive me, I said nothing. The square held its breath. Lydia lowered the ledger. Bram stood 6 feet behind her and did not move. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do before, gone perfectly blank the way a man's face goes when something hits so deep that the surface can't register it yet. Aldrich Voss. His father's name spoken aloud in a public square, for the first time in 6 years, attached to the truth that had been buried under a company report and a closed inquest, and the collective silence of men who found it convenient to look away. The iron ring on Lydia's finger had been forged from the pickaxe head Bram had kept on that cabin wall for 6 years. Not as a weapon, not as a tool. As the only piece of his father he had left, the one thing Harlan's men hadn't taken when they cleared the shaft. She turned to face Bram directly. He was looking at the ledger in her hands. His jaw was set. His eyes were dry in the way of a man who used up his grief long ago and had been running on something harder ever since. She held the ledger out to him. He took it, looked at the page. His father's name in a dead man's careful hand, witnessed and dated and signed. Then he looked at Harlan. Harlan had backed against his carriage. His hand was inside his coat. The sheriff was watching him with the expression of a man who has finally, at considerable personal cost, made a decision. Croft, the sheriff said, take your hand out of your coat. Harlan's eyes moved across the crowd. Pruitt, the councilman, the widow Marsh, who was now holding her passbook against her chest with both hands. The Garfield brothers standing shoulder to shoulder, with their father's swindle written in plain numbers in a dead farmer's ledger. He was calculating. Lydia could see him doing it, looking for the angle, the exit, the leverage point that would let him walk away from this the way he had walked away from everything else. There wasn't one. His hand came out of his coat empty. The sheriff crossed the square and took Harlan by the arm, and Harlan went, not quietly, but he went. He was still talking when they put him against the carriage, his voice high and precise, explaining to anyone who would listen about fabrications and conspiracy and the unreliability of deceased witnesses. Nobody was listening. The crowd reformed around the absence he'd left slow and uncertain, the way water fills a hole. Pruitt was the first to speak. He came toward Lydia with his hat in his hands and his face arranged into something that was trying to be contrition and landing closer to calculation. "Miss Thorne," he said, "the council would like to discuss, given your father's holdings and the mine rights associated with the Voss claim, which would naturally revert. We'd very much like you and your—" He glanced at Bram and chose his next word carefully. "Associate to consider remaining in Silver Pine in an official capacity. The town needs leadership that—" Lydia picked up the marriage contract from the hitching post where Harlan had laid it 30 minutes ago. She dropped it in the mud. Not thrown, not torn. Just released the way you release something that was never worth the grip. She looked at Pruitt for a moment, at his hat turning in his hands, at the 9 Thanksgivings behind his eyes that he couldn't take back, and she had no interest in returning. "No," she said. She turned, and Bram fell into step beside her, the ledger under his arm, and they walked to the end of the square together. The crowd parted. Not from fear this time, from something they didn't quite have the language for, yet watching 2 people move through them like they were already somewhere else. At the edge of the square where the mud gave way to the road, north, she felt the iron ring solid on her finger, rough, black, impermanent looking, and built to last. She didn't look back. Neither did he. The mountain was still there above the tree line, its peak catching the first real light of the morning. They walked toward it.